My guest this week is BRETT BOHAM. BRETT is a co-founder of the Forever Dog Podcast Network and produces the podcast Double Threat and The Best Show. He also hosts the movie podcast Movies Babyyy and Weekend at Bergman's, which stream live Thursday nights on YouTube and can be found wherever you listen to podcasts. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome to Revolutions Per Movie, BRETT BOHAM. Hi, Brett.
Hey, Chris, how's it going?
I'm doing great. Thanks so much for being here and picking 24-Hour Party People. I'm just so glad someone finally picked it, so thank you in advance.
Oh, my pleasure. I was just glad to see that it was still available. It was my number one pick, first thing I thought of. Yeah, it's a movie that's meant a lot to me over the years, and very excited to talk about it.
Well, before we get into the film, I wanted to ask you grew up in Georgia.
Yeah.
And, having a video store in Portland, I was just curious. You have two podcasts that you do about films. Do you have a formative video store experience in Georgia, like the one that taught you to love things that you didn't know about?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, there were so many of them. I mean, I just lived, that was just a weekly experience for me. Where I grew up, like in middle school, high school, there really weren't any like cool like indie stores or underground stores. Those would have all been in Atlanta, which was like 45 minutes away from me. But I had a Blockbuster and a Hollywood Video that were like across the street from each other, and so every week I would go to both. I would go to usually Hollywood first because they had a little bit more of an eccentric collection than Blockbuster did. So I would go to Hollywood first, sort of pick up a couple weird things, and then go to Blockbuster and just grab like a couple like new releases, and I always loved that mix of kind of the the high and the low, the like mainstream and the weird, and kind of going back and forth. So so I would hit those two up. It really wasn't until I went to college. I went to Athens, to the University of Georgia, and they had, at that time, it's not there anymore, but they had a store called Vision Video, which was just your classic college town, incredible video store with just like, listed out by directors. Even just like seeing that, just like that it was organized by directors, I was like, oh my God, this is what I've been waiting for. This is, and I had a list. I literally had been keeping a list in high school of like, I would read in magazines and stuff, a list of all the like weird, crazy movies I wanted to see that I didn't have access to. And they were just all there, like all laid out. And it was just like the most, incredible experience. But to give you one specific, the one thing I do remember specifically as being very formative is the other place I would go in Athens was on the 6th floor of the library, the university library. And I actually found out about this because they didn't really advertise it. But I found out about it because the B-52s, I would read like what the B-52s used to do in Athens to like, and try to like kind of mimic their like, all the cool things that they would do.
Of course.
And one thing that they mentioned is they would go to the video library on the 6th floor of the library and like watch Fellini and stuff up there. And I was like, the video library? Because I had never heard of it before. So I went up to the 6th floor, and sure enough, in like a corner of the 6th floor, there was this incredible VHS library, and you would have to watch the tapes there. They had little like cubicles with a TV.
Oh, wow.
But they had even the stuff that Vision didn't have. They just had like an exhaustive library of stuff. And so I specifically remember getting Fassbinder's The Bitter Tears of Petra von Kant there, and like sitting down and watching it, which has remained like one of my favorite movies of all time. It is just like it takes place in one apartment, but it is one of the most gorgeous, incredible movies. Just the way he finds like 100 different compositions that are stunning within this apartment, just using simple like foreground, background kind of tricks. The performances are insane. It's about a fashion designer who's like going through like a crisis and like a love triangle and all this stuff, but it all happens in this one apartment. And I have very vivid memories of sitting there, just in that little cubicle on like a tiny, like 4x3, just like tiny TV, just watching this movie and just being like, just in awe of it. So there was a lot of experiences like that, but when I was in college, but that one really stands out to me as like, this is it. This is all I want to do is watch movies.
That's amazing, because for me, there was a bike shop outside in the suburbs of Portland that had a little video rack in front, and it was mostly Fassbinder, Godard, Fellini, and that's where I saw Fassbinder was from a bicycle shop. He just had a hobby, and he would just let you take him and bring him back. And that's where I saw Fox and His Friends.
Yeah.
And, Bitter Tears and all that. And I got obsessed with Fassbinder because every film was so different.
Yeah.
You're like, oh my God, now he's like doing some weird sci-fi thing that he's starring in. And then now he's over here doing this amazing melodrama. And now he's doing this like super screamy. He just did the screamy comedy all of a sudden.
Yeah.
Like Satan's Brew or something like that.
Satan's Brew, is very funny and weird and wacky and and I mean, just ripping them off. Like 40 films by the time he's 40 years old and then dies of a heart attack. I mean,
4 films a year.
Just tearing them out. Yeah.
Incredible. The podcast you have, Weekends at Bergman's. You and your co-host Joe basically bring 2 films to the table every episode. One you would consider like an art house classic.
Yeah.
And the other would be a more popular film. Like, for instance, one of my favorites was Jean Dielman, 23 Queue de Commence, 108 versus Pee-wee's Big Adventure. And then at the end of it, you jettison one of them into space and you're not allowed to ever watch it again. What has been the most painful battle that you've had to do?
There's been a couple. We just did one that was surprisingly difficult for me, which was because right now we're in a 1999 series that's going to run through May, but then it'll be available, to go back and listen to, where we're only doing movies from 1999, and that's because I read this great book by Brian Rafferty called Best Movie Year Ever, in which he argues that 1999 is the best movie year ever, just based on the sheer quantity of like just sort of big swing movies, just like, Magnolia being John Malkovich, Audition, Blair Witch Project.
Right.
I can't even begin. It's insane. Like, he doesn't even cover all the movies in the book. It's just go and look 1999 movies and you'll be in awe. And so we're doing a series that's only 1999 movies, and we did Blair Witch Project versus The Mummy. And I'm a huge fan of Blair Witch Project. I'm a huge fan of just low budget horror in general. Just like Texas Chainsaw Massacre is one of my favorite movies of all time. And like, I just love kids getting a camera and doing a low budget horror movie, and it just crushes you. There's no better experience than that. And so I was like, this is probably gonna be a pretty easy one. I may have seen The Mummy years ago, but I really had no memory of it.
Right.
And this is the Brendan Fraser, like the first one they did of that new run. And I was shocked by how much I liked The Mummy. It was so good. And it was a perfect competition, because it was like indie low budget filmmaking at the highest level. And then for me, like studio filmmaking at the highest level, where it was just like, it was this great mix of CGI effects and sort of like analog old school effects. They didn't just depend on the CGI to do all the work. They still did incredible set design and costuming and this and that.
Right.
So the CGI sort of playing with more like analog physical effects. And it's just like a great Indiana Jonesy sort of like adventure. It's scary for a PG-13 movie. There's like body horror stuff in it. Like it takes some real risks for a studio film. So that one was surprisingly difficult. We did end up going with Blair Witch Project, but man, it hurts to not be able to watch The Mummy ever again, which is this insane sort of punishment we've decided ourselves to include, where we can't watch the losing movies ever again. So like, I can never watch Showgirls again, which hurts because it went up against The Red Shoes. That was a really tight one.
Right.
And I should say we don't always. Part of the fun is we have to be honest, so we can't you can't try to seem a certain way or say what you think the cooler answer is. You have to be completely honest with your actual sort of experiences watching the movie. And so we do not choose the art house movie every time. There's been a lot of mainstream movies that have won. So that is that's kind of the fun of it from week to week, is just you never know what you're going to get. You never know.
Oh, the pain.
It tells you a lot about yourself. It does. I know the pain is we wanted to add like stakes to it, which was, I don't know what we're doing, but that's what
makes it great. It's fantastic.
You get to watch us squirm on a lot of them.
If I did every episode and I was like, well, now I can't see 24-hour party people. That's just what we do on this show, is we talk about it and then I'll just never see it again.
Never watch it again.
I would crawl under the house and just wait for death to overtake me. I just would be done.
It's the one thing that I like about it is you watch these movies as though you're going to watch them for the last time. So you
Right.
watch them like as though like, okay, this might be the last time I ever watch this. I really want to take it all in. I want to have a real, I don't watch them, like, and I'm doing other stuff and I'm on my phone. Like it's sort of, and I think that was the ultimate idea, was like, let's like really like make these like special experiences where we're pretending that we will watch one of these movies for the last time. So sort of approach it that way. So it's, it's the give and take of an insane premise.
Well, the other thing you're known for is your fantastic transitions on Double Threat. And I was hoping you would maybe do a transition into us talking about this film.
Oh, great. Well, speaking of insane premises, this movie, 24-Hour Party People, is I think got rejected. I was reading by a lot of studios because they were like, who wants to see a film about Tony Wilson, that like guy in
Absolutely.
Manchester, and they were, and Michael Winterbottom and Steve Coogan were like, trust us, this is going to be really, really good. But I think it did get rejected by a lot of places because they didn't think the premise was something that would make it for a good movie.
Oh, it's amazing because Tony Wilson is a fascinating subject to have be the through line through it, which he was. But in so many interviews, he says, I didn't want to be the subject of this film. I had to be really convinced because it covers 1976 to 1992. And once, Michael Winterbottom and the writer Frank Control Boyce got a hold of him and said, hey, we want to do a long stretch of time, not just Joy Division's time, not just the Hacienda era. He kind of warmed up to it. But it is so funny. He's so prickly about this film. He just loves pointing out what's not true in it in interviews, what's real, about how he was just kind of pictured as kind of a twat in his own words.
Yep.
But he's really that guy. If you watch footage, if you go on YouTube and you watch Tony Wilson footage of him hosting his show, So It Goes, and introducing Joy Division for the first time on national television, he's so awkward and so weirdly professional. It's such an interesting choice that he was the guy who made so much of this come to life.
Yeah, he is like, your first glimpse is that he's like a square, that he is this sort of like square dude on TV. And that he's like he doesn't seem cool. He seems sort of like he's a little pretentious, like you say, he's a little prickly.
Yeah.
But there's nothing I like more than people who are pretentious, but then like back it up with like passion and with an unselfish approach to artistic collaboration. Because then to me, that's like, those are the ones who walk the walk, because it's like, there's nothing worse than someone who's pretentious and then is like hypocritical based on their ideals, or they're, or they just aren't doing anything, they're just sort of pretentious, like in a vacuum. But this is a guy whose pretentiousness was built on passion. It was built on a desire to represent the music of the city of Manchester, to find the best bands, to make them even better, and not to ultimately to not financially benefit to an unreasonable extent beyond how they were financially benefiting, to kind of share in the profits, and if there were any, there obviously a lot of times there weren't, as this movie explores. But he's a guy who is yes, he's pretentious, I guess, but he's someone who backs that up with action, and lived that DIY life for as long as he could, for as long as the money could last.
It's fascinating because, being a Granada TV reporter who's going out to do hang gliding, for instance, and watching him crash. I don't know if you knew this, but Steve Coogan, that footage is Steve Coogan flying, as well as the original Tony Wilson footage intercut.
Oh, wow.
So him crashing, they used a lot of the real footage of Tony Wilson tipped over on his side, and then just overdubbed Steve Coogan's voice over it. Steve Coogan is Tony Wilson, very slightly removed from Alan Partridge a bit,
Yeah.
Again, another TV presenter who's pretentious. But, Tony Wilson loved everyone in this film. He loved everyone he came into contact with, and he wanted to celebrate what was coming out of Manchester. And, he was one of the, classic 42 people who were at that first Sex Pistols shows, that Pete Shelley and Howard Devoto put on. Again,
Yep.
The numbers start adding up. You got members of The Fall.
Mm-hmm.
You've got Tony and his crew. You've got
Yeah, I mean, Joy Division / New Order is
when there was
there.
Stiffkin. There was Stiffkin at that point.
Yeah, and the funny one, the fascinating one is Mick Hucknall.
I know.
Simply Red was there. Yeah.
That blows my mind.
Yeah.
And I've also read that he's very apologetic that they kind of pick on Mick. He's like, he's a good guy, but someone had to fall. And then Martin Hannett, of course, who went on to produce all this amazing stuff. Do you have a show like that you saw that was so underattended that you were like, I can't believe so few people are here to experience this. This is amazing.
Yeah, there was one. The one that comes to mind, I think there was a couple like when I was in Athens. There's the one that comes to mind is White Stripes, like right before like the big kind of explosion. They were touring and they played at the 40 Watt, which is like, is a famous club in Athens, but it's not a big venue. And so it was like basically like a club show. They were like starting to get some buzz, and this was but they were still kind of like, that was that like Detroit garage rock revival period where there was like, I remember like other bands like the Mooney Suzuki and like Von Bondi's and people like that were
the Go.
They were kind of equal. Yeah, exactly. They were kind of, at the time, White Stripes were just sort of part of that. And I don't think had really distinguished themselves, as kind of the leader of that group, or certainly not, there was no indication they were going to be as big as they were. I mean, no one in their right mind thought that like grungy sort of garage rock revival sound was going to be like massively successful,
Yeah, that he'd be a legend.
Yeah. So I saw them, and it was like right before. I think literally like a couple months after I saw them at the 40 Watt was when they were, and I don't know if the dates are exactly right, but it felt like a couple months after that was when they were on the MTV. They did Fell in Love with a Girl on the MTV Music Video Awards. I don't know if that was a Michelle Gondry video or whoever did that, but whoever did that like Lego video, like that came out.
That was Gondry.
Okay, so they were on that Lego video came out, and then they were on the Music Video Awards, and then it was just like skyrocket to the moon after that.
Right.
So yeah, I saw them in the 40 Watt shortly before that, and it was incredible. They fucking killed it. And so you got the sense of like, there's like scope here more than I thought, and there's like a size to this. It really felt like they had something that was a little different than what everyone else was doing, even within their own like genre. So much with that stuff you sort of fill in retrospect. You fill in details that might have been real or might have not been. So I guess that would be the closest thing to my Manchester Free Trade Hall show experience would be White Stripes at the 40 Watt.
I had one weekend where, growing up in the Northwest, a lot of bands passed over the Northwest for a long time till kind of the grunge movement came along, and Seattle and Portland were kind of known entities. But I remember flying out to Ann Arbor to visit my girlfriend at the time. And in the course of 3 days, on Friday, we saw the Screaming Trees play to no one. On Saturday, we saw the Flaming Lips play to no one. And on Sunday, we saw Dinosaur when they were still talking to each other. Like I talked to Jay and Lou afterwards, and they're like, oh, thanks for coming. And like, I was like, when's the album coming out? And it was like, they were still kind of in each other's circle.
Yeah.
And it was so funny because it was like, these bands are amazing. But again, I would have never bet that the Flaming Lips would be this festival circuit, going to perform to thousands of people till the end of time kind of band.
Yeah.
Any of them. And they're all legacy bands now, But yeah, that was quite wild to be like, oh, being in the Midwest, bands actually come through. Okay. Yep. We were so sleepy in Portland. And it feels like in this film, Manchester is sleepy too, until, just the explosion of all the incredible bands that started being formed after the Sex Pistols show.
Yeah. And I love that, like, because it's such an industrial town, it's like, because it's a big city. It's like one of the biggest cities in England, I think, but it's such, historically like this industrial warehouse. And I guess maybe the American equivalent is like Detroit, which would make sense with the music too. Speaking of like, yeah, just very like industrial manufacturing town. But then the music, I think that's what was so great about Joy Division is that music like comes out of the city. It kind of reflects. It's like the sound of that city in a lot of ways.
I totally agree. I feel like most of the bands, whether you're talking about the Fall or the
Mhm.
Buzzcocks or Stone Roses, there's
Yeah.
something that you're just like, of course they're from Manchester. It just feels different. And all those bands sound totally different than Joy Division or New Order. But there's something about the language in the city and the way it pushes
Yeah.
back and
Yeah.
that it could only have been created
Yeah, and that's
there.
why this was such a big movie for me because I actually didn't. This was one of those discoveries for me where like I liked a lot of things and I didn't realize they were all connected until I think watching this movie and then starting to sort of explore more around it. Because I loved Joy Division and the Smiths and Stone Roses, and then kind of from a neighboring town, I loved Pulp, from Sheffield, and I loved all these bands individually, but I honestly, it seems crazy now because, like we're saying, that the being from Manchester and being from the north of England is such a part of these bands' identity. But I was, young and kind of figuring stuff out and learning about stuff, and so it was after I watched this movie that I went and I was like, oh my god, all these that makes so much sense. Okay, so all these like bands I like are all from basically like the same part of England, like the north of
I know,
England.
me
And I was
too.
like, okay, that's make that like then like the connection starts to be made, and then I'm like, well, what other bands are from this area? And so yeah, this was like a big. I've always had a love affair with like music from the north of England, and even before I
Yeah.
knew it, and then starting with this movie was when I became sort of more intentional about it and sort of understood that they're all from the same place.
Yeah, the same thing happened when I started discovering all the Glaswegian
Mm.
bands. It just be like,
Yep,
what?
yep, yep.
Oh, they're all from
Yep.
Glasgow. Like I didn't know where they were from. I thought they were from the UK, and then you're like, oh right,
Hmm.
okay.
Yep.
Scotland. All right. And finding out about Postcard
Yeah.
Records and oh my gosh, I still love that. I still love being able to discover a scene within a city and devouring it and then just putting all the pieces together. I mean, I still feel like, you went to college in Athens. I still feel like the Athens story is always going on, with the Elephant Six stuff and now with Limbo District stuff being reissued, like this band that people just talked about. They didn't play much, but all this archival stuff's coming out. And the B-52s,
Yeah.
it's wild that certain cities, like I never would have identified the B-52s with Athens.
Yeah.
To me,
Yeah.
they were always like some New York band. But of course, it makes so much sense when you get to know the people of Athens and the scene in Athens. You're like, of course, it had to start there.
Yeah, and there's some. I mean, it's interesting you say that too because I know the B-52s and then some of the original like scenesters that kind of started the Athens scene. They had the ones who were like the original luminaries with the B-52s had been in New York, like Warhol era in New York, and I think there's one guy whose name I'm forgetting who was like the kind he's one of the he was never in a band, but he was one of the just original sort of creative forces of that scene. He had been like kind of in the factory scene with Warhol, and then they come back down to Athens, and so they're bringing sort of like what they saw and heard and stuff from New York at the time to Athens, but then the Athensness sort of takes over and turns it into something completely homegrown at the same time. So it's kind of like I think that's always happening that there you'll get a little like the Sex Pistols, for example, like they come up and they sort of lay the seed in Manchester,
Right.
but then it becomes Manchester's own thing. The Manchesterness takes over. Now it's very similar, yeah, in terms of what started the Athens scene. And I wonder too, like if part of my what I like about sort of music from the north of England is that like in England the north is like the American South. They're kind of like like the Hicks. They're not like coming from like London from like the main cosmopolitan centers. And so there's they're kind of can be treated as like sort of like out of touch or like not connected to to what's going on in New York or LA, and then they sort of use that outsider status as like a badge. Like I always think of like such a big moment in Southern culture and music is like when Outkast like got I think it was best new artist at the Source Awards, and then like said the South has something to say, and then like all the New York and LA like artists are like booing them off the stage. But yeah, that like the South has something to say has always been like a big banner for Southern culture, Southern hip hop, Southern music. And so I feel like that is what drove the Manchester scene as well, as like Manchester has something to say. Like it's not just all about London and all about the south of England.
The UK press, my wife is from Scotland and she just said things just sweep the nation, right? So in terms of fashion, records, film, you find out about something that's happening somewhere, and all of a sudden, everyone is dressing like the Happy Mondays all of a sudden.
Yeah.
And her brother worked in a record store, and I have a series on my phone of like 6 pictures of him in different styles, like Texie's Midnight Runner. All right, cool. Now you look like you're in Happy Mondays. And it's just like fashion was such a big thing to it. And when I was talking to Gary Jarman from the Cribs, he's from Wakefield, which is also north of England. And he said in interviews they would print their dialect phonetically, almost to make fun of them, of their accents. And so, but you're right. To him, he was like, it was also a badge of honor. They just had a fight because they just created something from nothing.
Yeah, I remember that even with like Arctic Monkeys, who came from Sheffield as well, which is just right, I think, to the east of Manchester. Is a great music town too. Yeah, I remember reading like early reviews of that first Arctic Monkeys album, and they kept talking about like the way they would pronounce words and like dialect, and like, isn't this funny? He pronounces like gun like gun and all this stuff, and I was like, it's just interesting that like there is this sort of like the North is like treated with this sort of like fascination of like, oh, aren't they kind of like weird, or aren't they kind of funny out there, like, you know, the different ways they say things and this and that. And it's a way of like, you know, it's a way of, I think, creating a distance or sort of marginalizing a little bit, you know, in the mainstream press. But then, you know, I mean, you look at the Arctic Monkeys, they're like the biggest, you know, touring act to come out of England of that kind of era. So it's like, you know, the music ultimately speaks for itself.
The British press really, I've talked to a lot of musicians about this over there. They really like to kind of tear down the success stories.
Yeah.
They like to be there at the beginning, but once they get a little too big, they're really happy to be like, you're no longer relevant. This is relevant. Joy Division, Tony Wilson sees them, but they don't really like each other in terms of a way of trust. And because he's really square and very Steve Coogan-y. And they are like, why haven't you had us on your TV show? You know, what's your deal? And these things really happen. Tony Wilson said their relationship was antagonistic, but also full of love for each other. They really did a contract in blood where he basically said, the artists can tell us to fuck off.
Yeah.
They own everything. We own nothing, which of course, in the end, ruins Factory Records and everything he built up, because they realize they don't have to go through Tony Wilson for anything.
That is like, man, that is, in addition to like the music, this movie works for me on so many levels, and it's a movie that has like changed for me as I've gotten older, and you know, because in kind of like a smaller sense, you know, I've been doing the same thing that Tony Wilson does in this movie for the last, you know, about 10 years of my life, which is like running a small indie, you know, production studio and label, more or less. And that, it's funny because that closing scene where he has the, you know, they're in their kind of newer, fancier office at the end of the movie that they've overpaid for, and he paid $30,000 for a table and like
incredible.
and was it a New Order's manager like literally tries
Rob.
to like fight him, tries to fight him over it because he's like, how dare you spend this money on this table? But then this like fancy record producer from London comes up and is going to talk about, I think, producing the new Happy Mondays album or buying it.
Yeah, they want to buy it.
Yeah.
But there's no vocals on it yet.
There's no vocals, so they have to hide. Tony Wilson plays them the instrumental intro, and then it's like, if you want to hear the vocals, you got to buy the album, but there aren't no vocals yet. So it's a funny little trick. And then the guy actually makes an offer for the entire company. But then that's the point where, and this is the scene that over here, Forever Dog, we always talk about, where Tony Wilson takes the blood oath napkin off the wall that they framed, and says, we don't actually own any of the recordings. We don't own, this is the closest thing we've ever had to a contract with our artists. And the guy's like, so he's like, so I don't have to work with you at all? And Tony Wilson's like, he's like, no. And then he has this great line about how I prevented myself from the dilemma of selling out by not having anything to sell out. and then the guy's like, you're fucking crazy. And it's such a funny scene because it's like, it's just the duality of like, we get into this for the passion and for the love of it, and very similar to Factory Records, we have, you know, very artist friendly contracts over here because we believe in that and it's important. But the other side of that is you're constantly on the knife's edge of just, you know, getting crushed by capitalism and money and power and all that kind of stuff. And we've had very similar situations where we've built up acts from nothing, from being in our bedroom doing bedroom recordings, and then worked with them and built their shows up, and they've become successful, and then a bigger company has just come in and taken them away,
Right.
we get nothing, and it's like, oh my God, like, why, and you feel a satisfaction of having like kind of helped someone become successful and believed in them and known about them before anyone else, and there's a real satisfaction and a pleasure in that at a level. But then there's also it's so hard to get out of first gear when that's the world that you are committed to, is like the DIY indie world. And so you learn all the tricks, you learn how to make it work. But it is, watching this movie, I'm just like, I get it. It's just, you're on a knife's edge all the time. That's just the realities of it.
Yeah, and also this was definitely in the era of selling out was a big concept.
Yeah.
I remember just saying no in the 90s to advertisers that wanted to use our music and be like, no, we can't do that. We would be toast. And now, you're like, oh, Portugal the Man is on Taco Bell commercials. Like everybody's like, congratulations, because it's a badge of honor now. So I think it's so funny. Like nowadays, I know there are labels that still have handshake deals. Even Touch and Go with the Butthole Surfers, that ended up being very litigious and very complicated. And you're like, I like both those parties, that just sucks, know.
Yeah.
One thing I wanted to ask you about is, in this film, we've talked a little bit about how people treat Tony Wilson. He's the boss, but he's also lovable and goofy, but they're really happy to call him a wanker. It seems like everywhere he walks, he's being called a wanker from across from, whether you're standing in line or walking past someone. And he's just so used to just being put upon. But it's like, this person made this thing that you're going to enjoy, but you still can't let him enjoy this at all. And I wanted to ask you about, when you started producing Double Threat.
Yeah.
And you started coming in as an active participant in their conversation. You're working with two people who are some of the smartest, quickest, brightest people, Julie Klausner and Tom Scharpling. Yep. The stuff that comes up with them happens in real time for you. Like all of a sudden they're like, what did you say?
Yeah.
What'd you say, Brett? And then all of a sudden the next 50 minutes is about something that innocently fell out of your mouth.
Yep.
And it's done with love, just like Joy Division does when they read him all the time. As a listener, sometimes it's like a nerve-wracking experience to listen to it because you're like, oh no, here we go. And it's so entertaining. But working and producing in real time and then all of a sudden realizing that, oh, I am now going to be a subject of this for a while. What is that like?
Yeah, it was like shocking at first, and I mean it's been so much fun, and it's my favorite thing in my life. Yeah, but it was funny because it's just like I've produced like I think over 50 podcasts at this point. I've been doing it for so long, and my goal is always just help the talent realize the potential of the show, right? So help that, like, people come in. I mostly work with comedians, and they come in and they have an idea, and I'm just here to help you realize it. And most of the time that just means, I make sure it sounds good and gets recorded right, and help you book guests if that's part of it, help you market it, help you monetize it, and then sometimes add in like sound design if that kind of enriches it, or is appropriate to it. And so that has always been my role. But with Double Threat, it was the same thing. I came in, I was like, how can I help you make this better, help you make this bigger, contribute in whatever way. And it just so happened on that show that like part of what was going to sort of realize its potential was having this like producer character on air. And it wasn't something that sort of happened just very naturally. Like if you listen to the early episodes, I'm barely on it at all. I'm just introducing the clips. But I just sort of followed their lead, and I could tell that they wanted me to sort of be part of the show a little bit more. And so I would just sort of go sort of step by step with that. And then I think we just stumbled into this character that is it's me. I like every story I tell on the show is real, but I certainly exaggerate my personality a little bit and sort of play the,
right,
like you said, kind of play naive a little bit, play the innocent, as though like I don't sort of understand what I'm saying. It's usually my goal is to sort of act like I don't understand. I don't fully comprehend what I'm saying, because because you can't be. I realize like early on, I'm not like Tom and Julie, like you said, are comedy icons. That to me, they're two of for me the reasons I got into it, and so it was just they're the best, and so they don't need me to be like make jokes. They don't need me to be like sort of um funny in and of myself. They need me to like give them fodder that they can riff off of. And I just realized that like one of their favorite types of fodder is just me telling a crazy story, and then them coming in and like sort of doing the riff on it. So like I can't, so I have to sort of play innocent as though I don't know what I'm saying, because I can't give away the like premise and the joke. I just have to give them the premise and then they find the joke. And look, I will say I don't want to overestimate like myself. Like there are times where I didn't know what the joke was, and then they find it and I'm like, oh my God, that's so funny. And so I think over time you do sort of, I just have sort of become that character. When like the recording starts and my brain just kind of flips a switch and I'm just this sort of slightly different version of myself for the next 2 hours. And I'm just, I just try to like, and I will like over, sort of in my life now, when I remember something from the past, I'm just like, oh, that's like a weird thing that happened to me. So I got to remember that if it ever comes up on Double Threat, or if there's ever an opportunity
Right.
for it. So yeah, it's been an absolute blast. It is funny that people, because I was behind the scenes forever. No one, I was on every show I ever produced. I was completely behind the scenes. And then this one is the one that people have that listen to our shows have started to get to know me through, and so they all think that's it's like who I am, and it's not who I am. It's just it's just sort of a version of myself that fits for this show, that fits for what Tom and Julie are trying to do on the show.
Oh, it's incredible. Yeah, and I'm not comparing you to Tony Wilson, but it is funny because Tony, he wants to be behind the scenes, but he's also dragged out in front.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
In this movie.
Yeah.
And right out of the gate, he says there's three geniuses in this film. It was Ian Curtis, Shawn Rider, and Martin Hannett. And I am just, a mere vessel
Right.
here, to just come along with me. Are you very familiar with Michael Winterbottom's other films besides the Trip stuff?
Yes, yeah, I've tried to see most of everything he's done, particularly after watching this. I like the trip. At this point, what four? I mean, they did the TV series, but I guess there's been four movies.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, that to me is like the other high watermark besides this. I love the Trip series. I really like that, sort of in the vein of the two. I think this is what led to the Trip, actually, is his Tristram Shandy movie, A Cock and Bull Story, yeah, which I really think is great. And I think it was like the improvised scenes between him and Rob Brydon in that movie is what led them to do the Trip. So I really like that a lot. And then he's always takes interesting swings. 9 Songs, that was like, kind of, it was known for being like, it was an NC-17 movie and there's all this sex in it. But it's a pretty interesting movie about these two people that always like sort of hook up like around a concert or see each other at a concert or this, and then like their sex life is sort of like told through these 9 songs. And like he's done like sci-fi, and he's done other
Welcome
stuff.
To Sarajevo.
Welcome to Sarajevo. Yeah, I mean, it's just a really interesting career.
Agreed.
I think besides this 24 Hour Party People, Tristram Shandy, and the Trip, to me are like, those are the ones that I connect with the most, and all feel like kind of the same universe. But I'll always watch anything he does. He's really interesting.
I didn't know that most of this film was improvised either, until recently. I mean, obviously the Trip and so many of the other films with Steve Coogan are, but for something that is so just trying to tell the history of something, I was just kind of fascinated that so much of it was just off the cuff. It feels scripted.
Yeah, because there's so much detail to it. It does, and I think it's just a testament to this like crew of sort of British actors and comedians that are in it. I mean, I because this was also, in addition to like connecting a lot of dots for me musically, this was the first thing I'd ever seen Steve Coogan in, and I remember I saw this, and then I saw Coffee and Cigarettes came out shortly after that, the Jim Jarmusch movie.
Sure, of course.
And I had loved 24 Hour Party People, and I was like, who is this Steve Coogan guy? I didn't know anything about Alan Partridge or anything. And the premise, he has a short in Coffee and Cigarettes, it's really funny, with him and Alfred Molina. And the premise of that short is that Steve Coogan is like he's like very famous in England is the premise. And but famous in a way that is like he's like trending, you know, he's like very hot
Yes.
right now is kind of the idea. And so I saw, and I thought he was like just in this indie that I had liked. And so I was like, wait, this guy's like famous? Like what has he done? Like who's this guy? And this stuff is so hard to like understand now when everything is just immediately accessible. But like I started looking into him and I was like, okay, so he did this like, you know, Alan Partridge character, and then he was on the show The Day Today, and like, but like I couldn't get any of this stuff because it was like YouTube hadn't come out yet, and like, you know, I looked on eBay, but it was all like they only had like the Region 2 DVDs that play in England, but don't
Yes.
play in America. And so I
Right.
kind of gave up on like, I'll just like remember, you know, kind of mark that away in my memory. And then it wasn't until I went to grad school in Philly, and there was a guy in my grad class who was from Manchester. This guy was like my like guardian angel or something. His name was John. He was from Manchester, and he had brought over not for any just for himself, I think, not knowing that he was going to meet someone who had similar interests, but he brought over in his bag all of these Region 2 DVDs and like digital files of Alan Partridge, The Day Today, Mighty Boosh. He had like black books that show that Dylan Moran
Sure.
did, like just all this great British comedy, and just shared it all with me. And so I got to like binge Knowing Me, Knowing You, and then like the later Alan Partridge stuff and all the Day Today. Which if you haven't seen is incredible. Like or if your audience hasn't seen, is that like the Daily Show before the Daily Show in England,
Right.
and like way darker and crazier. And a guy named Christopher Morris, and then Armando Iannucci co-created it with him, and Armando Iannucci went on to do Veep and The Thick of It and tons of great shows. But that was where Steve Coogan started as Alan Partridge, and I guess had been on the radio before that. So so it wasn't until like grad school and my friend John that I this whole world like opened up to me, and I was like, okay, so he was like this character. Like so when people in England saw 24-hour party people, they had the whole Alan Partridge prehistory that I didn't have.
Yes.
And so he's kind of like, in a way, he was like playing against type for that audience, because they knew him as Alan Partridge, and now he's playing sort of this savvier, cooler, hipper version of Alan Partridge. But for me,
Right.
the Tony Wilson was the first thing I ever saw him in. So then the Alan Partridge was like was filling in the other side of it for me. And then I've just become obsessed. I mean, Alan Partridge is one of my favorite things, ever.
Oh, it's still incredible.
Yeah.
I think the latest 2 series that he's done as Alan Partridge are some of the best.
Yeah, it keeps getting better. It keeps getting better. Yeah, I think
Yeah.
like to me, like Mid Morning Matters, I think is still my favorite. But that's that
Yeah,
one in
it's great.
between. Yeah, like in it, but I was just amazed by the new stuff. He just always finds, for a character that is like seemingly sort of one dimensional. Oh my God, he finds so much in that character over and over and over again. It's the best.
Yeah, there's a lot of actors in this film that was the first time I'd seen him, right? I didn't know what Andy Serkis looked like. He plays Martin Hannett, and I was like, I mean, he's wearing a wig and some glasses, but it was like, oh, that's him? Okay.
He's so good in this.
Oh, he's amazing. And Paddy Considine as Rob Gretton.
Yes.
Who Tony Wilson says he's like, the people of Manchester love you, Paddy, because we don't know how you captured him, but you did. He said all his mannerisms, the way he would burst up from a chair to fight, like you mentioned that table scene.
Yep.
He was like, it was spooky, he said, how much Paddy figured out this person who had passed away earlier, and could from the script and through improvisation totally inhabit him.
That's amazing, because I sorry, real quick. I love Paddy Considine, and I think I like seeing him here with like some piss and vinegar, that kind of a character, because I think a lot of times he plays sort of like sweeter kind of characters, or at least did earlier in his career. It's so fun to see him here just with like an edge. He's so good.
Also, Sean Harris as Ian Curtis.
Yeah.
Really incredible, because the film Control is made not much longer after this film came out.
That's right. Yeah.
But if you watch like an Ian Curtis live performance, he totally inhabits it in such a perfect way. Not a parody, not like I'm going to learn every move, but just he really is Ian Curtis in form and function. It's incredible.
He's so good in this, and I like Control a lot. I think it's really good, and it's gorgeously shot. But you do have the little bit of the hurdle that like Sam Riley, the actor, is just so good looking and like so kind of like a model. And I think everybody does a great job on that. But like just physically, immediately, Sean Harris with just those gaunt facial kind of structure and everything, and it's just like that like sort of twitchy, herky sort of like movements. He just immediately has Ian Curtis just like nailed. It's amazing.
Yeah, and just this relationship with Tony Wilson, how we'll sit down next to him and just start torturing him.
Yep.
It's just like mean and playful at the same time, which the band seemed to have that spark between each other. And, when they're working with Martin Hannett, again, another great character who comes in and is just like, we got to take apart the drum set. I hear something. Let's put it on the roof
I hear
now.
a rattle. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's just like, he did make so many amazing records. A lot of them I didn't even know he touched until, after I'd seen this film. But like he even did like ESG.
Yep.
That first You're No Good 7-inch.
Yep.
Certain ratio, which is a minor character.
Yeah.
For comedic purposes in this film. Like he says at one point, about a certain ratio, he goes, I wanted a band of my own. A certain ratio had all the talent and energy of Joy Division, but better clothes. And then he just goes back there and they're in these like desert rat outfits and they're putting bronzer on their legs and playing to no one. And I could just see Tony Wilson being like, all right, I'm helping manufacture this. Like Joy Division is fully formed.
Yeah, exactly.
But here's a band that I can tailor. And the film is so funny too. As much tragedy as there is in this film, I think Michael Winterbottom does a great job with having elements of absurdity in it, where like a UFO will visit Shawn Rider all of a sudden, or Shawn Rider is like, it's like he's Robinson Crusoe all of a sudden without clothes on a rock in the ocean. Tony Wilson talking to himself as God at the end of the film.
Yep.
I think those moments work really well in a film that doesn't need them.
Yeah, I agree. I think that is really the key, that like that's the thing that drives the whole movie, is that like that the humor of it, the comedy of it, the incredible playfulness with the structure of it, breaking the fourth wall, etc. I think to me this is like, because you have great like punk movies, Repo Man or whatever, movies that like feel like punk. This to me is like the ultimate post-punk movie. It has like the kind of energy and anarchy of punk, but then combined with this more sort of like intellectual side and playful side and comedic side, simultaneously takes itself seriously and then doesn't take itself seriously at all, in kind of the right ways for both of those things. And so, yeah, this movie to me feels like the ultimate post-punk movie. Sex Pistols comes and plays for them, and then they take it from there. Yeah, I love it so much. And I always, there's another Martin Hannett line from that when he's recording the first Joy Division record that I always quote to, where he's like, faster but slower. And they're just like, and these kids are like, what the fuck is this guy talking about? But then that amazing, so you get that kind of, it's like, it's funny and it's chaotic, but then you get like the rhythm of the movie. Then you get that scene where they're all driving around the car listening to She's Lost Control, the She's Lost Control demo, like on tape. And it just like, they're all trying to like, because they always want to like kind of say everything's shit and that we're shit and it's never going to be good. And then, but slowly throughout that car ride, they all kind of are forced to realize that like, oh no, we're making something incredible here. We're making something sort of iconic and like seminal, but they're all hesitant to acknowledge that. And Ian Curtis even has to like hear it from Shirley Henderson's character. She plays Tony Wilson's wife in the movie, or one of Tony Wilson's wives. Yeah, she's amazing. From Train Spotting and 100 other things. She's great. Yeah. Yes. And so he, like Ian Curtis, like he doesn't believe it when he hears it from Tony. He doesn't even believe it when he hears it from the bandmates. But then when he hears it from her, something about, she still has sort of a badge of like sincerity or authenticity. And so she tells him like, no, it's really good. And then you can see him kind of like believe it for the first time. And yeah, that scene, just like the way the rhythm of the movie between moving from comedy to tragedy to sort of scenes that are a little more sort of delicate and gentle, to scenes that are just like rough and crazy. Like the rhythm is just so amazing and wild.
I'm so glad you brought up that scene in the car too, because it is such a rite of passage when you're young to be like, we got to listen to it in the car and drive around. And, you're just looking at where you've grown up or wherever you've made this thing, and it just informs just the emotion of hearing something. And I just thought they captured that really well, because, it is a scary moment where you're like, okay, we worked up to this. And then it's like, is this good or not? And I just thought, it was just lovingly done. What was so funny was I was watching the commentary on this, and there's this really beautiful scene about it. And then Tony Wilson is like, actually, this car is 1 year later. This is not correct.
Right,
This,
right,
and I was
right.
like, this is why Tony Wilson is
Yeah,
Tony Wilson.
exactly.
It,
It's like, we don't care, Tony. Not now.
yeah,
Not now,
yeah.
Tony.
You're like, he's like, yes, this really did happen, but this car, and you're like, oh my
Yeah,
God. The other
yeah,
amazing thing I found out from getting the DVD to watch this is I was watching a making of segment. It was like 10 minutes long, and they actually filmed a sequence with a fake Stone Roses in this that never got used.
oh my
It's in
God,
it
I
for
would
like 3
kill to
seconds,
seeing
but
that.
you're like,
Oh
there's
my God.
Manny, and I'm like, why?
Yeah,
Why did they shoot that? What was it for? Because they were not part of this story. Really,
yeah,
the first half is Tony on Granada, Sex Pistols show, Joy Division, Ian Curtis's death. Second half of the film is New Order, the creation of the Hacienda and Factory Records, Carrying On,
yeah,
and Happy Mondays, and then the demise and the falling
yeah,
apart of everything.
yeah.
And I think I was never a Happy Monday fan. Were you? Were you ever into that?
No, no, Stone Roses are big for me, but
Me
Happy
too.
Monday was, yeah, I think it was like if you missed the moment on Happy Mondays, it's
Absolutely.
kind of, it was such a moment kind of, in music with like, you know, like I mean that they talk about it, like ecstasy and the Happy Mondays and the scene and like raves. It was music that was meant to be experienced in a very specific moment in time and in specific places, I think. And if you missed it, it's hard to. I go back and listen to those albums and I try, because I
I,
love the movie so much and I love the Shawn Rider character, but it's hard to recapture what was happening.
yeah, I
It's
agree.
yeah,
I think it
yeah,
moved past my age group a bit.
yeah,
And when I go back and listen to it, it has a lot more guitar than I think it does. Like when I heard it back in the day, I
yeah,
was like, oh, this
yeah,
is really like Oregon driven dance music with, electronic drums. And I hear it now, it's way more organic than I imagine. But it's still, I feel like I haven't found my entry point. Like I'm like
yeah,
Kinky Afro is great and they have some good songs.
yeah, yeah,
But the fact that Tony Wilson doubles down over and over again in this film, that
yeah,
Shawn
yeah,
Rider is the
yeah,
greatest lyricist since Dylan.
yeah, yeah. He's Yates. He's WB
I mean,
Yates.
yeah, yeah, exactly. So it's just incredible. And I have to go
Yeah,
like, okay, I better start reading into this and, breaking down like, oh, this first verse is about his father. You can kind of see it, but I could never appreciate it at the time.
yeah, and I think it's funny too because I feel like their biggest legacy, the thing they always get remembered for, is like Bez
Absolutely.
has become like a word just for, Bez was like the Flavor Flav of England. He was like the, like when you think of like a sidekick in a band, someone who's like the hype man in the band, Bez is just almost like Kleenex. Like Bez is just the word for that person now, particularly in England. Um, and other than that, though, it's definitely music that was just of a time and maybe hasn't like aged as well as the other stuff. But again, I live to be proven wrong on this stuff. I would love for that to change for me at some point. It's like you said, it's about finding the right entry point.
Yeah, and this film, again, a great film makes you want to go and devour something, a great
Yeah,
music documentary. Even if you don't like the band, you're like, oh, well, maybe I should go buy this record. And then you're like, no, the documentary is great. Their story is great. I'm not into the music. But I love how they portray the Happy Mondays in this. Again, a lot of fiction, a lot of fact.
yeah,
They did not ransom the tapes, which is a really great plot point that Tony
yeah,
Wilson in
it's a
real
great
life is
scene.
like,
Yeah, yeah,
this is such a great story. Did not happen. But that basically they make this record and then they're like, you're not going to get it back. We want 200,000 pounds. And then again, of course, Rob starts jumping off his chair to go strangle whoever's giving
yeah.
the bad news. And then they eventually show up in a bar and they're like, I have 50 pounds. He's like, great, here's the tapes.
After firing a gun at Tony Wilson in the
He
bar.
did fire the gun, though. He did fire the
That's
gun. And
that's
that's a true story,
that's
but not related to
crazy.
this.
That's
And I
crazy.
think they capture the mania of the Happy Mondays so well. The
Yeah,
one thing that gets to their character more than anything else is Bernard Summers producing a record and he's eating and he puts the food in the trash. I think it's Shawn and Paul Ryder dive into the
dive for
dustbin
it.
and just start
Yeah,
eating it together. And I'm like,
yeah.
yeah, I get it. I get who you are. Like,
I love that moment so much. There's so many good specifics with them. And there's another one later where they're like, when the big fancy record guy from London comes up and Tony has like a big spread out in the studio and they look at it, and Shawn goes, "I'm not eating fucking bunny rabbit food. I'm going for a Kentucky," meaning like a bucket of KFC. But going for a Kentucky is such a funny phrase. I like, yeah, it's another one that I like quote from time to time. There's so many of those lines in this movie, but going for a Kentucky always cracked me up.
The other thing I didn't really remember until I rewatched this again was how much gun tear there started being in the scene, that basically it was Manchester got named Gunchester. And basically they really did pay off drug dealers to be door people to just keep everyone happy, because the Hacienda was basically a full purpose giant warehouse that they made into a performance space that didn't kick off until the Happy Mondays came around. Like, they'd have all these amazing bands playing and no one would show up. And then once the Hacienda started having these shows that were kind of rave culture and drug culture, they lost a lot of money because people weren't buying alcohol. They were spending all their money on ecstasy, and it was going to the drug dealers. The drug dealers were making the money, but at one point they were paying over 350,000 pounds a year to door people just to manage the violence within their own circle. Some of those scenes remind me of the helicopter scene in Goodfellas, where Ray Liotta's looking up through the window and Tony Wilson is getting all coked out and having to interview politicians and getting fired, and everyone's just like sweaty and losing their mind. I think it's comical the way they approach it, but I thought they did a pretty good job. You know, it's really hard to do those scenes about, and then we got out of our minds on drugs.
Yeah. Yeah. And the other one, there's another aspect, because there's all this stuff about the scene. The scene is like constantly in danger of just descending into chaos. And there's another scene like that early on where they briefly hit on what is such a kind of scary part of the British music scene at that point, but was the fact that like the Nazis and skinheads were always like on the edge of like good music scenes and like trying to get in. I mean, we think about how skinheads started out as like just a strictly sort of music thing and then descended into like, you know, kind of Nazi white supremacy. And similarly, because Joy Division was, you know, I mean, they were, I guess in their minds, they were doing it somewhat ironically, but were like incorporating, you know, from their name to different things, Nazi iconography and stuff into the band, particularly early on. And, you know, there's that line where Tony Wilson says, like, haven't you heard of postmodernism? Like, in his mind, it's all just this sort of like playful irony. But there can be real costs to that kind of playful irony, which is that, you know, there's that scene where a bunch of skinheads from the National Front, which is like a far right organization in England at the time, show up at a Joy Division show and are like doing like Hitler salutes. And the band like fights back against them and doesn't want them associated with the music. But like, you know, that's kind of you know, I think what happens sometimes when you start to sort of like do this sort of like, you know, when the irony can sort of circle back into somebody else's sincerity, you know, at a point. And so, I think overall the movie does a good job of like, you know, it's not about those things, but it does a good job of like not shying away from them either, and sort of incorporating them at the same sort of breakneck pace that it incorporates everything else. You know, kind of like this stuff flies into the movie and then flies out. And then there's other stuff, like there's movies like This Is England and stuff that obviously, you know, delve into that kind of stuff in much greater detail.
Right.
But this is a movie that is just like going 100 miles an hour start to finish.
It really does. I love the pacing of it right out of the gate. I guess the people who did the title sequence were the people who did all the Happy Mondays iconography and cover art and stuff.
Sense. Yeah.
Tony Wilson saw
acidy sort of like, yeah.
And when Tony Wilson first saw the 3-hour cut, he said, "This movie is shit except for the title sequence." The whole movie. And so it was like funny to be like, well, why does he like the title sequence so much? Oh, of course, it was real.
Yeah.
The other character that's in this film is the Hacienda itself. When I was over playing in Manchester, I made our tour manager drive by where it was. I just was like, I just got to see it. And they're like, it's not there. And I'm like, and then there's like a little plaque and it's just apartment buildings. And you're like, okay, I'm sorry, I made us go.
Wow.
But they really did an amazing job. Tony Wilson said that they recreated it so well that even the brick they used was perfect. Right shape size, right color, and that everybody who walked into the space that they recreated, because it had just been torn down 9 months before, ironically, they were in tears. He said it was so emotional to be in that
Wow.
space. But it's so funny. They walk in, it's the most reverby, echoey, misplaced place to have live, loud music. It's just like, this is horrible.
Yeah.
And the other person that plays a minor character in this film is Peter Savell, who did all of the factory design work and artwork. And factory, you can go online and they list all the different things up to around 500 that they did. And some of my favorites were, it starts really simply. Like they would just number everything they did. So the first one was the original factory poster.
Yeah.
And then like number 3 was a poster for Joy Division and Cabaret Voltaire. And then Factory 7 is a factory note paper. And Factory 8 is a design for a menstrual egg timer. And then Factory 51 is the Hacienda Club. And Factory 61 is a lawsuit involving Martin Hannett. And then Factory 136 is a sellotape in green with a new logo. Factory 191 is the Hacienda Cat. Factory 253, the Chairman Resigns event. And Factory 501, Tony Wilson's coffin, which was the last one. And he's not even dead, but they're like, we're making you a coffin. And that is Factory 501. So the sense of humor and the sense of arrogance and the sense of everything being as small as, okay, it's cellophane tape, to things that were just changed the world, like the Blue Monday sleeve with all the different cutouts in it and the 4-color printing and the way that they lost money for every record sold. It is a big part of the film too, although they don't really go into it. But I love that every time Peter Savell shows up for something, the event had already happened.
He's always late. Yeah. Oh my, that's my favorite. It's my favorite. Yeah.
They're like, it's beautiful. That was yesterday. I know, but I needed time to finish it.
Yep. That is my favorite. One of the funniest scenes in the movie is when he shows up to the gig with the posters for the gig and very nonchalantly is like, hey, here's the posters. And Tony Wilson's like, you're at the gig. This is the gig. Like, what good are the posters now? But then and this is why the movie is so good. Is it never stops with just like that's a great joke. That's like the great obvious joke. But then it goes like a beat further and he looks at the posters and he's like, oh, these are really good. he's impressed, even though he's mad that they're late. He's always impressed by stuff that is good, that is artistic, and that kind of takes over, and he loves that. To me, in a way, that's like what Tony Wilson's in it for, is just those moments of like beautiful chaos where everything comes together and it's not making money and this and that and you're always in debt and this, but like, man, it's beautiful and it's memorable. And I think it's funny that Tony Wilson was so like, it's just his personality to be sort of against, or to be sort of like, critical of this movie. But this movie is his dream come true, because this was the whole, you see it in the movie itself, where like he kept everything. He never sold out, never compromised, kept everything sort of at the highest artistic level possible, and always sort of erred on doing things like that were memorable and that were that sounded great, as opposed to made a lot of money or looked great in the case of the album sleeves that lost them money every time they sold one, with the hope that, look, this is all going to crash and burn at some point.
Right.
But then if we commit to it now, at some point it's going to become iconic and people are going to remember it as iconic.
Right.
And so this movie, he could not have gotten a better movie than this to memorialize the time. Yeah, it's the perfect movie, and it paid off his whole gamble in a way that, sure, the thing crashed and burned, and you probably didn't walk away with a lot when it was all over. You probably walked away with some debt, but you did it well, and now it lives on. And then, sure enough, 20 years, however many years later, you get this incredible movie, and now it really lives on, in everybody's collective imagination. He has to pretend to be sort of, huffy about the movie, but he loves every second of it, because it paid off the whole gamble for him.
Yeah, I think we're really lucky that this film was made when it was. I mean, now it would be an A24 film, and it would be a lot more claustrophobic and tragic and darker and kind of, I don't think it would be as fun. This film is a lot of fun. It's very heartfelt. And I think they were very cautious with it. There's a lot of cameos in it that are surprising. Howard Devoto and Marky Smith is in it. You're like, how did they get Marky Smith to stand there and be
all right, Tony?
Yeah, just like, what? But
not a good accent, but
there's something about the film that these films are harder to make than this movie makes it seem. The success rate of films about music that are either biopics or narratives that are fictional but about a certain thing, it's easy to pick them apart, to just be like, I don't know, that Elton John thing was like, This film, even though it was of a time where, I was too young to be in this when it was going on, I believe it, and I find it really inspiring and very loving. And I just love that it has, like you said, it goes 100 miles an hour.
Yeah.
And it's hard for me to pick something in it where I'm like, oh, it starts dragging or they didn't need this. It feels essential. And I think that's really hard to do.
It's so hard. And there's Todd Haynes' Velvet Underground biopic that came out like last year. I think it reminds me of this a lot. I mean, very tonally, it feels different, but I think the approach is very similar of like, we are going to try to, like, in the very fabric of the movie, the way it's edited, the way it's shot, everything, we're going to try to reflect the spirit of this time period and the spirit of this era in music and culture. And so that it's not just going to be sort of a traditional movie about, the movie itself is going to feel like it came from this time period.
Right.
And it's a risk because that's hard as hell to do, because then you're like, it's like then you're really competing with the artistic sensibility of the time. You're trying to match it. You're trying to replicate it, which is this thing that, these things get lost. They get lost in time. They're hard to replicate because they came from a specific time and place. So it's a big risk, but man, when it pays off big. I think with the Todd Haynes documentary recently, this movie, they're few and far between. Most people play the safe route and they give you Bohemian Rhapsody or whatever. But this, man, when this kind of risk pays off, it's just an absolute thrill. Do you know if that Stone Roses deleted scene is available, or is it?
I'll go back and I'll film it and send it to you off my TV.
That'd be amazing. Yeah, because I'm a huge Stone Roses fan, and and it makes sense because they're kind of the bridge from like Manchester to Britpop, right? Yeah. So they're kind of after this, they're in between the two big sort of periods. It's funny because I feel like Ian Brown's personality is the blueprint for Oasis. Like musically, they're very different, but his persona is the blueprint for Liam Gallagher. And the thing that amazes me about Stone Roses and also like Pulp in Sheffield is that because I watched that Pulp documentary, like Life, Death, and Supermarkets or whatever it's called, and then I watched this Stone Roses documentary recently that was around their like reunion tour, which like quickly fell apart.
Yeah.
This documentary about the Stone Roses, and the one about Pulp, you realize, like, because for me over here, these are this is like high art. Like Stone Roses and Pulp are just so good. That first Stone Roses album and everything Pulp has put out is just my absolute favorite. I love it so much. But then you watch these documentaries and you realize that these bands like everyone in Manchester and everyone in Sheffield loves these bands. They don't I don't know, like too pretentious or too difficult to get into. Like these are like the bands of the city. And in this Manchester, in the Stone Roses documentary, they do this like unannounced concert. They just start like announcing on the radio, like Stone Roses are playing, today at 8:00 wherever, and you have to bring like a copy of a Stone Roses album to prove that you're like a fan of the band.
That was kind of great.
To get in. Amazing. And like everybody from the town is showing up, all types of people, everybody's coming to see the Stone Roses because this is like the band of the city. And they even like one of their songs off of that first album is like the Manchester United like the soccer team's anthem that they play. I gotta remember the name of this.
It's not Adored. It's probably not Waterfall. It's probably
This Is the One.
This is the one. Okay.
Yeah, that big and you can go on YouTube. I've looked at it. It's kind of crazy that like this entire soccer stadium, they put on This Is the One before the game starts. oh, they're getting so hyped and it's like, oh my God, this is the one. I used to like listen to this driving around. I didn't realize it was like a soccer stadium anthem, but that's because like these, like in the north of England, these bands that you might out of context think of as like kind of like, indie bands or art house bands or whatever. Yeah. No, they are like, that's the big band for that city. That is like, whatever the Led Zeppelin of that for that city. It's like the biggest band in the world to them.
Yeah, isn't that amazing?
It's incredible.
Yeah, and just that one city had, usually you'd be like, oh, you get one Stone Roses, right? That's that's what your city gets, or you get a Joy Division. But the fact that you're like, oh, you also get the Fall and the Buzzcocks, you're like, fuck you, man. Like,
I know.
I'm like, why would it be there so badly? Brett, thank you so much for being here. I always ask the same question at the end of every interview, but I tailor it depending on the film we're talking about. So on a scale from 1 to 50, with 1 being the lowest and 50 being the highest, how many times do you imagine hearing someone call Tony Wilson from across the Hacienda a wanker do you give this film? 1 wanker to 50 wankers.
Well, this is a tricky one because I don't know. It's tough to know in which direction the scale goes. Is more wankers?
More wankers is better.
More wankers is better. Okay, great. In the spirit of the film, more wankers is better for sure.
Exactly.
Oh my God. I mean, I gotta be honest. This for me, this is a 50 wanker movie. This is it for me. This is one of my all-time favorites. Like I said, it was the first one on my list when you asked me. I was so glad no one had done it yet. This is just for me, it's like the beginning. It's just one of those movies that like, it's just the beginning of so many interests and fascinations, and the movie itself is great.
Yes.
There are movies that like, there's movies where like I have a pad and paper and I'm writing everything down, but like the movie is kind of forgettable, but it's mentioning all these great things. Like this one to me is both. It is, the movie itself is an absolute banger. It kind of, to me, doesn't really have an equal. I don't know of a movie that I mentioned like that Todd Haynes Velvet Underground documentary is kind of doing something similar, but is its own thing. For me, this movie stands alone. It really doesn't have an equal in terms of the way it captures the spirit of a particular musical era. And it also introduced me to Steve Coogan, introduced me to so many great sort of British actors and comedians that I've gone on to like in other things. So it is a 50 out of 50 calling Tony Wilson a wanker from across the Hacienda for me.
That's perfect. That's what I have written down here. That is correct. That's the correct answer. 50 wankers. Brett, thank you so much. So good to see you. Thank you again.
Thank you. This was a blast.
Thank you for listening to Revolutions Per Movie. We release new episodes every Thursday. We are a completely independently produced affair, so the best way to support us is to rate and review the show on your favorite podcast app, and to subscribe to our Patreon over at patreon.com/revolutionspermovie, where you can get exclusive weekly bonus episodes every Sunday, as well as one-of-a-kind handmade Revolutions Per Movie goods that I send out to you. You can follow the show on social media at Revolutions Per Movie and find more information about our various guests in the episode show notes. Thanks again, and we'll see you next week. Bye!